Good evening, everyone. Good evening to everyone present here in the Council chamber and anyone listening from home as well. I'm Councillor Hamish Adurian, the chair of the Flood Risk Management Working Group. I will ask all my fellow colleagues on the working group to introduce themselves. We do have apologies from Councillor Stuart Graham. Colleagues from Eva?
Hi, my name is Eva Diot. I am a councillor for North Kensington Dalgana Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Arian Areti of Holland Ward. Thanks.
Hello, Councillor Joanna Gardner, Pembridge Ward.
Sophia Lambert, I don't know what I am, a Kensington elder who's been co-opted onto this committee.
Thank you very much. Before I ask our guests to introduce themselves, I'll just briefly recap the purpose of our working group and the purpose of the meeting this evening. This is the fourth out of a total of 5 sessions that the working group has held in public, gathering evidence on a range of matters related to flood risk management, with specific emphasis on the events of last July. The purpose of tonight are present this evening, some aren't, so I will make sure we cover all of those topics this evening. I would note briefly, I'm sure you are aware, we will not have time this evening, and indeed this meeting isn't the place to go into detailed casework. I do appreciate many of you present do have individual casework that does need addressing, and we will wish to address that and express that. But again, the purpose of tonight's meeting is to understand the general issues and gather evidence to inform our recommendations. And with that, may I ask our guests to introduce themselves? Graham.
Good evening, I'm Graham Castleman from Thames Water. I am the Strategic Planning Lead for Wastewater for London.
Good evening, my name is Alex Nixon. I'm the Head of London Flood Response for Thames Water.
Good evening, I'm Doug Taylor. I'm here from CCW, which is the Consumer Council for Water, which is the independent organisation established under the Water Act, independent of any of the companies that CCW deals with, which are all of the water companies in England and Wales. We are a non-departmental public body under DEFRA, and our interest is to ensure that the consumer voice is heard in the sector, and we deal with individual complaints that consumers have.
Thank you, Doug. Callum, could we have Mike on? Thank you. And Mike, hello.
Sorry. Hi. Sorry, I thought I was called earlier. My name is Mike Woolgar. I was the chair of the independent expert group running the London Flood Review. I am a water engineer and a strategy advisor, and I ran the Flood Review on behalf of Thames Water and the local authorities. And I'm here this evening to answer questions if anybody wants to ask me any.
Thank you very much, Mike. And with that, since we have you with us now, could I ask you to maybe give us an overview of the report and its recommendations? Now, I appreciate, of course, it is very much an extensive report, but perhaps in your own words, maybe you could tell us a bit about the background to your work, what you were commissioned to do, and the broad nature of what you found and the recommendations. If you could give us an introduction, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, yep, that'll be fine. Okay, so the purpose of the review was to try to understand what happened and why it happened, with particular reference to the 2 events, which was the 12th of July and the 25th of July, understanding that there was, significant flooding and a lot of people's homes were damaged, a lot of businesses were damaged, and a lot of transport infrastructure and hospitals and other sort of facilities were also damaged in the event. We wanted to understand, as far as possible, how the flooding occurred, what went wrong, if anything, and what might be a solution or a set of solutions and recommendations for improving the situation in the event that flooding of this nature would happen again. And so our approach was very much to try to gather together all of the evidence that we could get about what happened, to run a series of investigations using a software development model that represents the sewer system, to examine a number of the flood alleviation assets that exist. So that includes the sewers, the pumping stations, some of the flood alleviation schemes like Maida Vale and Westbourne Grove flooding scheme, which were installed over the past few years, and to consider whether or not they were functioning correctly, to consider how the flood event, where it stands in the sort of pantheon of severity, and what recommendations we could come up with to try to support a better management of events and better management of the flooding that occurred. So that was the overall approach that we had. And we divided it into the 4 sections. The first one was discovery. The second one was looking at the initial analysis. The third one was looking at examining the assets in more detail to see how they were actually functioned during the events. And the fourth report was the summary and the recommendations. I'll move on to the overall findings. Now, the 2 events on the 12th and the 25th of July were very different in some sense, but they were very similar in another. They were both quite extreme events. They were extreme events in the sense that the level of service, the intent for which the sewers that Thames Water own are designed for, they're designed for a 1 in 30-year event, plus climate change. And these events that occurred on the 12th and the 25th were markedly more severe than that. Their severity was of 2 types. One, there was very intense rainfall, and that has a problem in terms of whether or not the water can actually get into the drainage system or whether it's retained on the surface. But there was also a significant volume of water. And the significant volume of water means that even in some cases where it could get into the drainage system, it was actually more than the drainage system could cope with. It was more than a 1 in 30-year event. It was more than the sewers were actually designed or capable of managing. So they were both highly intense and also quite a lot of volume of water in both occasions. Added to that, there was a rather unfortunate event that both the 12th and the 25th, the rain fell at around about the same time as the River Thames was up at the highest level. And the problem with that is that an awful lot of the water was held in the sewers. It normally would drain out by gravity. There are pump stations which also pump the water out of the system. But the gravity outfalls to the Thames were blocked by the high water level, which kept the flat valves from releasing the water at the rates that they would like to. Now, we did wonder whether or not there's any reason why high rainfall and high water levels in the Thames could coincide, but we can find absolutely no reason other than it was just bad luck. But it did exacerbate the problem in both events, both the 12th and the 25th. We looked at the operation of a number of assets. Now, the assets that we chose to look at included 2 of the major pump stations, Lots Road Pump Station, which is owned and operated by Thames Water, Hammersmith Pump Station, likewise owned and operated by Thames Water. 2 of the schemes which have been installed in the last few years, Maida Vale and the Westbourne Grove Flood Alleviation Scheme, which were designed to protect a number of houses which had previously flooded. We looked at the effectiveness of the FLIPs. Those of you who are not aware of FLIPs, these are Flooding Local Improvement Project schemes, and essentially they are property level protections to ensure that basement flooding through the sewers cannot happen. There's a non-return valve and a pump which prevents any water from backing up from the sewer system into the basement. And we also looked at what benefit, if any, could have arisen from the Thames Tideway Tunnel had it been complete at the time of the events. So our findings with respect to those were that the Lotts Road pumping station was slightly delayed, minutes delayed in turning on, and it did have a small but very marginal impact on the flood levels. It was very marginal because the volume of water that arose was so significant that even had the pump station been turned on 5 minutes, 10 minutes earlier, it would have made little or no difference to the number of properties which were damaged, which were affected. So that was an effect, but a very minor one. The Hammersmith pump station, which has 9 pumps, of those 9 pumps, 1 was tripped out. It wasn't working at the time. This is not an unusual occurrence because of the 9 pumps, there's quite frequently 1 out for maintenance. But even so, that also reduced the overall capacity of the pump station to pump water out of the system. Again, it was marginal, but it had a small impact. Marginal in that it was around about, I think it was about 8 or 9% of the capacity of the station was not available. Given the amount of water, it made little or no difference, but it made a difference. We examined the Maida Vale and Westbourne Grove systems. They both operated pretty well. Most of the houses that were designed to be protected were protected. There were a few that were inundated, but we understand that may have been more to do with surface flow rather than anything through the basement, and that is being investigated. And there were some additional properties which had not previously been flooded in that area, which were flooded, without having done any further work on it. I suspect that was to do with the severity of the storm rather than a defect of the system, but it definitely needs to be examined to see whether or not those properties should have been protected by the system, or the systems could be extended to protect them. In terms of the flips, they were very successful on the whole. I think there were 1,300 and something installs since since 2017, I think. Thames can confirm. And generally, they were very successful in stopping water flooding back up through the sewers into basements. Again, we had some reports of failures, and Thames will need to investigate those, but generally they performed very well. As I said, we also looked at whether or not the Thames Tideway Tunnel would have helped, and if so, to what extent it would have helped. Learned something quite interesting about the Thames Tideway Tunnel. The way it is designed to be operated is its primary function is to stop the Abbey Mills combined sewer overflow toward the east of London, flowing into the Thames. And what that means is that the way that the scheme is to be operated is to preferentially take flow from that CSO, from the Abbey Mills area. So if there is a predicted heavy rainstorm, which is heavy is expected to be 22 millimetres of rain across London, then the way that the Thames Tideway Tunnel is operated is essentially to close down the flows from this part of town into the Thames Tideway Tunnel in order to make space for the water that's coming from Abbey Mills. What that means in a nutshell is that for an event of the scale, the size, the type that happened on the 12th, there would have been very marginal benefit arising from the Thames Tideway Tunnel. It was not designed to stop flooding, it was designed to prevent storm sewer overflows. So that was quite a revelation to me. I had the sense that it was going to be of more benefit, but we had the designers of the scheme come along and talk to us on a couple of occasions to explain to us why our thinking was wrong and why the Thames Tideway Tunnel was being operated or would be operated in that way. The last thing that we looked at really was we had a review of whether or not a Countess Creek type tunnel would have been beneficial. One of the reasons that the Countess Creek tunnel was not installed was because of the complexity of connecting it into a tunnel, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, while it was being constructed. And anyway, the construction of the Thames Tideway Tunnel means that any Countess Creek type tunnel solution would have to be differently managed down at the bottom end where it goes towards the river. So we looked at a design version of that to try to understand what would have happened. And it did make some difference. You'd expect it to make some difference because it's effectively a new chunk of storage which can accept some more flow. But it has the same problems that it's connected into the combined sewers, it's connected into the existing system, and when it surcharges and the other systems are also surcharging, you end up with flooding pressures into basements and water coming out of the system for the larger events. So for this event, this size of event, the Countess Creek type of tunnel would have had little or no benefit. But that again is really a function of the type of event, the scale of the event. I've used this sort of mini anecdote previously, but one of the residents, when we were going out and talking to residents, asked me a very interesting question, which I've kept in my mind. She said it was a really terrifying occurrence for her to be caught in this flooding, devastating. What she wanted to know from me was whether the drainage system was broken, i.e. it had failed and therefore it could be fixed, or whether it was a massive event that would be unlikely to happen again. Either way, she would be more content than just understanding this could happen all the time. I think we could say with some confidence that nothing was really broken. It was a major event. But what we can also say is that the heavy rainfall events that we saw on the 12th of July and the 25th of July are more likely to occur more frequently under the influence of climate change. Whether they'll be so severe is moot. I think it's unlikely, but we can expect there to be more severe rainfall in the coming years. And so I could partly satisfy her question, but not entirely. So what did we recommend going on from what we found? Quite a lot of I've talked about the technical findings, but clearly there were a lot of non-technical findings, and a lot of people who were flooded found it, it's a life-changing experience in many ways. It's horrible, but they found that they were unable to make contact with people to help them. They didn't know who to talk to. They didn't know who was the best person to get support from, and they felt very let down by the whole process. This was not uncommon. It was also true on the 25th of July in northeast London, where people had the same sort of sense that they didn't feel that there was a coordinated, controlled and managed response to give them comfort that people were taking them seriously enough. And that is a fundamental finding, that the overall approach to this sort of flooding event, which is a combined sewer and surface water event, needs tighter control, it needs closer messaging, it needs more information, and it needs to be looked after in a more strategic fashion. What is clear is that if you get large storm rainfall events, they cannot all be shoved into the sewer. It won't work. And even if it does work, the people at the bottom of the system are likely then to face the risk of being surcharged through their basements, sewage being pushed back into their basements, unless there are non-return valves, flips, etc., to protect them. That means that in the long run, it's important to spend more time, more effort over the next few years to ensure that water is more safely managed on the surface, that it's kept on the surface as far as possible. It doesn't all get into the sewers, and therefore it doesn't all threaten people's basements and threaten people's houses. But that is a long-term objective. It's a difficult thing to achieve in somewhere like London, where an awful lot of the surface is well occupied by existing houses, car parking spaces, pavements, roads, etc. Nonetheless, it is something that needs to happen. The responsibilities, as you are aware, for surface water management are not simple. The local authorities have responsibilities. Thames Water have responsibilities in terms of accepting storm flows to some extent. But what has to happen, and this is one of our recommendations, was that there does need to be a much more structured, strategic way of considering how these risks arise, where they arise, and how one might work best to ensure that water is retained on the surface safely. And that is a planning issue, that's a land planning issue. So some of that falls into the remit of the local authorities. It's not entirely the local authorities, it's also local authorities working with developers, it's working with the highways authorities, it's working with the water companies, but it requires coordination. This is not a sort of rocket science. We've looked at other cities around the world where similar problems have arisen and similar responses are required. There has to be a strategic look at how floodwater arises, where it goes, why it goes, how it might be managed and how it might be held up to stop in safe places, to stop the water compromising, damaging, ruining people's livelihoods and lives. It's not a problem that's going to go away. Within that sort of strategic context, there needs to be planning between local authorities and the water company, between local authorities, the water company and the blue light services, to ensure that people who are at risk have consistent messages, people who are at risk get sufficient information about what they can do to help themselves to ensure that they are protected as far as possible, what people can do in terms of recovery from the initial impact of being flooded, how you report it, and we also need the strategic view on how to collect and manage data and information so that we can actually do a strategic overview of where the risks are and how they are in a more confident way. One of the things that we discovered while we were trying to develop our report was how hard it was. It was so hard, ridiculous it felt like, getting hold of information about the events, getting hold of who flooded, where they flooded, when they flooded. There's some people were very keen to talk to us and other people were not. The information we could get from the local authorities was, it came at different times, it was in different formats. All of this is understandable, but it actually can't carry on. We have to do something in a more structured, strategic and managed way. Otherwise, we will never be able to solve this problem. If we're still talking about trying to have a strategic view about how to manage surface water, how to manage the surface and piped water systems, sewer systems, in 10 years' time, we will have failed, really. So a lot of the recommendations we made are around, they sound terribly boring, but they are about governance, and governance is really quite important. I said before to all my colleagues, it doesn't sound very sexy, but governance is important. If we understand what we're doing and how we're doing it, then we have a chance of doing it right and doing it in a controlled way. There is quite a lot of money available for managing surface water flooding. The Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee has something in the order of, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like over a 6-year period, 800 or 900 million pounds to spend on flood management, of which 40 to 50% is intended to be dedicated towards surface water management. But trying to access this money, trying to create viable projects, appears to be enormously difficult. It's enormously difficult because it's resource intensive, it's quite hard, there's a lot of paperwork to fill in, and the local authorities are not well resourced to do this. So we want some more work done on how to make this simpler. We want groups of authorities to work together to try to apply for the money in a more slick way, and the procedures and processes need to improve. And this all falls under the heading of governance, which, as I said, sounds very boring, but governance is required with monies to follow. And I think there is a definite need for spending some money in an organised way in London in order to try to prevent this sort of event from happening again.
Mike, thank you very much, and there'll be plenty of other opportunities for you to come in. You've given us a lot of thought-provoking content there, Mike. Before we ask you questions, and I know we have quite a few of them, I'd like to invite our colleagues from Thames Water and also Doug from the Consumer Council to maybe offer some of your reflections on what Mike has just said as well. If Graham or Alex, and then followed by Doug.
Let me start with that. Yes, so I mean, obviously we were incredibly concerned about the flooding, and we wanted to get to the bottom of why it happened. Was there anything obvious to blame, an easy solution to fix, and what would, if there wasn't, what would be the implications for the future? So, you know, I'd like to commend the work that Mike and the rest of his expert group did in producing this report. It has been very helpful in highlighting that essentially when you have rain of this intensity, it doesn't recognise any kind of regulatory boundaries, doesn't recognise any kind of mostly geographic features as well. It runs overground. Sewer flooding becomes surface water flooding, becomes sewer flooding, and therefore the only way we get to solve this is to work better together. And it was very useful for Mike and his team to sound that out, because it highlights that there is no one body and there is no one magic bullet that can make this problem go away. What he also sounded out was that you need this multi-layered level of resilience, which starts with protecting those people most at risk now. You've then got to look at slowing, delaying, retaining water on the surface to give the drains a break, whilst we tactically potentially increase the capacity in pinch point areas, but also that eventually any system will be overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the rainfall. And what we need to be is more creative about what we keep dry and what gets wet in these mega events, because we cannot build a big enough system to keep everything dry all of the time. And therefore we need to look at keeping those most vulnerable, most important things dry, but potentially temporarily and safely storing water on the surface to then enable those things to stay safe and then gradually drain it down into the system.
Okay, thank you. Doug?
Thank you. I think Mike did a tremendously good job in being able to explain the relatively large complexities around the work he did in a manner that I think we can all appreciate and understand, and I think that's a great tribute to him. I think there are two elements to this. There's how do you prepare to to try and prevent. And I think there are some issues in there about some of the things that could be done. And secondly, if there is an event, how effective are the various agencies in dealing with that event and ensuring that residents are not left in a position of distress and a position of uncertainty. And I think all the agencies that have an interest in this, whether it be the local authorities or Thames, have to ensure that there is a more effective and coordinated approach, both I think in the preparation for such events, but when they take place, the communication channels with residents need to be effective, and people need to be able to get through on the phone to get answers to questions, and they need to subsequently be able to get answers to questions, whether it be from the local authority or whether it be from Thames. So I think there are some really significant lessons to be learnt from all of this, and I think it would be extremely distressing if an event like this occurred again, if it was exactly the same in terms of the response from the agency. So I think there are some clear messages there, and I'm sure that residents who've suffered this terrible distress in this recent event can put more texture on that. But I think there's a challenge there for everyone. There's a challenge in prioritising spend, and I know that's difficult both for the company and also for the local authority in the current situation. But there are challenges there, and I think it's for everybody to try and use their best endeavours to support the residents. And there has to be an effective process for residents to complain if they don't get what they consider to be effective responses to the questions they raise.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug. If I may kick off questions to Mike, we can get Mike back on. Mike, one of the things you mentioned, I think it is quite important for us to dwell on it just for a moment. You talked about the Lots Road pumps, you talked about the Hammersmith pumps, you talked about Tideway, and you talked about Counters Creek as well. And fundamentally, if we understood correctly what you said, what the report is saying, even with all those things in place, even if the Lots Road pumps had been activated earlier, even if Counters Creek had been built and operational at the time, the impact would have been, sort of paraphrase you, minimal. Could you maybe explain that a little bit more, or maybe even quantify what that minimal is? Would there still have been flooding to the same extent? What sort of impact do you think would those various operational elements have had? Or do you fundamentally think the impact would have been so minimal as to be negligible?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. It's quite hard to answer, but I will attempt to. So, yes, if you are unable to pump water out of the system, then effectively, wherever you've got ponding, there will be more water in there. The area over which the water was ponding, or which was where it was being stored, if you like, in people's basements in their houses, which is an unfortunate place to put it, but that's where it went, it would rise a bit. In terms of a bit, we are talking about millimetres. Maybe in the worst places, it might have been 50, 100 millimetres. Now, the reason I said that's marginal is not because 50 millimetres doesn't matter to the person who's just been flooded by 50 millimetres. That matters. But actually, most of the people who were being flooded to a significantly greater distance. And so they were already flooded. 50 millimetres, is adding insult to injury. It's not actually changing the facts of they were being flooded. So that's what I meant by marginal. It sounds a bit callous, but it's not. What we're saying is that the number of properties, the number of houses that were flooded in these circumstances was X. Had the pumps been working exactly as intended or better than intended, that might have reduced that X to X minus 5 or 10, but it wouldn't have made a huge difference. And I think that's quite important to understand, because it was to do with the volume. Now, what that implies is if you had a system that was capable, if fully operational, to manage a 1 in 30 year event, and a 1 in 40 event happened, or a 1 in 30 event happened, you might have got some flooding if the pump stations weren't working to their full whack. So at the lower end of the sort of frequency of event, it might have made a difference. But at this particular event, the large events, it was marginal. I hope I've explained that reasonably well. It's a little bit like saying, you know, the bucket is full, put a bit more water in, it flows over. Put a bit more water in, it's still flowing over. Well, you know, it's a marginal difference.
Thank you, Mike. Colleagues, Arian, Councillor Retty.
Thank you, Chairman. Question to Alex and probably Thames Water could comment. Just I know in the report, in the conclusion section where you have communication response to flooding, it clearly says that the Met Office couldn't give a predicted warning. Imagine if the Met Office have given a clear warning that there would be huge, you know, rain over 20 centimeters. Did the Thames Water, or could we handle this even much better? First question. Second question, did Thames Water have a resilience plan or an emergency plan, or in fact, you know, a incident management plan in order to, you know, prevent this flooding? Thanks.
Thank you for those questions, Councillor. So, could we have done more if we'd had longer warnings? So, just to remind people that the Met Office forecast that gave a yellow weather warning, and they forecast 24 millimetres of rain. We actually had nearly 90 millimetres of rain over the 2 hours. So, you know, it was significantly worse than anyone predicted. So, if we'd had, you know, days' notice, could we have done something different? Frankly, in that volume of water, no. Even if we'd had every tanker in the UK on standby, ready to pump water into it, we would have dropped the flooding levels a little bit, but we could not have prevented the flooding. It just simply was more intense than the system could cope with, and there isn't anything we could have done differently. We could have given warning, you know, worked with local authorities to give warning to people, and that was one of the major lessons we could do, but their properties will still have flooded. We could have helped people, you know, people would then have been able to move precious and irreplaceable items, and we could have reduced the heartache, but the flooding would still have happened. On the question of do we have a resilience plan? Yes, we have very detailed resilience plans, and there is a London-wide flood resilience plan. But again, neither of those were enacted because we were going on the most likely forecast from the Met Office, which was of the order of 20 millimetres of rainfall over the storm, which the system would have been able to cope with.
Could Mike comment on this, please?
Mike, any thoughts on Councillor Retty's questions?
Thank you.
Do we have
Given a better warning, whether the events could have been handled differently. I think that given the quantity of water, had the Met Office correctly predicted that, there would have been a bit of a Mr. Fish about it. People wouldn't have believed it because yeah, that it was a lot of water. It would have put people more on the mettle, I think, to think about how to respond to it. It might have allowed people to be more responsive at the event, but it would not have stopped the amount of flooding. I think that you have to think about two aspects of flooding. One is the damage that's caused, and the other one is how do you respond to ensure that people are safe, are being responded to. And I think that had there been a better, more precise warning, it would have been possible to be better on the second bit. It would not have made a difference to the amount of flooding.
Thank you, Mike. It's fine.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of follow-up questions. First of all, to Arian's question about warning people. I seem to recall that in certain flood risk parts of the country, there is a system whereby people sign up to receive automatic emails whenever there's a risk. I think even if it doesn't prevent the flood, people still want to know. And it might be that in this particular case, because there was only a yellow warning, you wouldn't have activated such a system. But there must be cases where it would make sense to activate such a system. And I wonder if Thames Water has, or anybody else has, a system of warning London residents of potential flood problems. That's my first question.
Let me answer that. So yes, you're quite correct. Where there is river and tidal flooding, people can sign up for a warning system, and it's an opt-in system. London, the Emergency Planning Service in London also has the ability to push messages through mobile phone signals. So if you are in an area that is likely to be flooded, they can sort of mass push text messages to those areas. It hasn't been tested in London, but it requires a red, effectively, weather warning. And so it hasn't been trialled and it hasn't been tested. So we would remain to see how effective it would be. I think we've got a major piece of work to do with all the London boroughs about firstly identifying where are the basements. We do not know collectively or individually where basements are. We don't know very well who is vulnerable in those basements, and we've got to give them a useful message to empower them. So this summer, just before the sort of the summer convective storm season, if you'll excuse the jargon, the Mayor of London and ourselves and various others worked together to put a message out, leaflets to, I think, about 56,000 properties where we thought basements were, to try and give them that sort of what to do if there is a flood warning. And I think we need to follow up on that to see, you know, did it have any success? Did it resonate with people? Were they more and better prepared? But you're quite correct, Councillor, that there is no system that is tried and tested in London to get people to warn them of flooding and to help them respond.
Just, thanks. No, it's all right, it's working now. Chairman, you spoke about Lots Road. Now, the pumping station there. People in the Portobello tell me that there was a sort of river down the Portobello, and at a certain moment, it all drained away. And many people believe that this was the moment when the Lots Road pumping station was turned on. Can you elucidate why it suddenly drained away and what this was all about?
Sorry, are you asking me or the
I don't know
Mike?
who I'm asking, but one
I
of
think
the
maybe
assembled
Walter will be able to
flood
give a response,
experts,
and then we can ask Mike as well.
perhaps
So
Mike?
just to confirm, you know, Lots Road pumping station was working. The delay in turning it on was slow and is basically due to the nature of the system. So in both pumping stations, when they reach a trigger threshold, so the water is high enough in what's called the wet well to prime the pumps, they were turned on. But they particularly the Lots Road is a slightly dated system, and it does take a while to warm up and to come into full operation. So I do not think that there was any significant delay in that, and therefore it wouldn't have made a sudden difference to the flows. I suspect that something happens in that the storm finished, the flood water had moved through the system, and the pumps were then able to draw down against that head, is why people perceive that sudden drop in flood water.
Well, I'm
Can I
not
add to that? Could I add to that what
Yes.
Safaz just
Ella,
said?
we'll come to you in a second,
Okay,
if
all
we
right.
may.
It's just to do with
Mike,
lots.
could we bring you in on that? Do you have any thoughts on Safia's question?
Can I also ask a more general question? This report has quite a lot of interesting recommendations in it, although I would make the observation that quite a lot of them are basically asking for increased funding, and I think that in the current climate is very unlikely to be forthcoming. So we're going to have to start thinking of solutions that don't require massive increased funding. My concern is that this report has a sort of scattergun set of recommendations for a whole lot of different bodies, and I have a horrid feeling that it will just sit in trays unless somebody pulls together an action plan, allocates actions, and decides who's going to do what. Are there any plans for this?
So the first two recommendations basically say that we need an overarching strategy for London to manage surface water, because the solution for, say, London Borough A might lie in London Borough B, and therefore you need to have that more strategic view and enables collaboration. And that needs to be led by a strategic group of the organisations with a responsibility and capability in this area. So I'm very pleased to report that progress in setting up that group and creating the strategy is well underway. We've got the names of the bodies representing those agencies all agreed now. We're in the process of signing off the terms of reference. We are bidding to the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee for funding for a chair, a project officer and a secretariat. We are in the stages of agreeing the scope, and this independent reviews, findings and reports will be a key part of drafting that strategy. So, you know, that's where I see the strategic group leading this work, and the strategy will look at these recommendations and determine which of them need to be taken forward and how. Certainly as Thames Water, we've commissioned this report. We have a deep interest in seeing that this doesn't just become something that goes in the back of someone's in tray or levels a desk up, and seeing these actions come to life, because we've committed a lot of time and resources to them, and we believe that they are all important to deliver. So we've got a vested interest in that, and part of my role is to track the delivery of these and to make sure they find a home, or we find a better way of doing it because things have superseded the original recommendation.
For all the recommendations?
All 28 recommendations.
Right. Incidentally, most of us haven't seen the 78. We've only seen the 26.
There are 28 recommendations. 28 in the report, yes.
Mm.
Could I ask Mike to come in on those two questions? And then I'm aware there's a resident who needs to leave at 7:30, so I'll invite him to ask a question as well. Mike.
Yeah, okay, so there were two questions that I heard. One was about Lots Road and one was about the recommendations. So, yes, on the Lots Road pump station, we received quite a lot of information from residents saying that they felt that the Lots Road pumping station had been at fault, and they were very keen that we investigated it. And that's one of the reasons why we did that, because it clearly was an issue for people. So we asked Thames for evidence of what had happened, when they turned on, how they turned on, and what measurements they had. We eventually got it, and it did demonstrate that there was an offset, a small time difference between when an ideal time of turning it on when it was actually turned on. We're talking minutes, so not a huge amount of time. And we tried all sorts of ways to model what we had. We have a computer model which it represents the pipe system and the pumps and the outfalls. And we tried ever so hard to see how we could recreate what was reported to us, and we couldn't. That's clearly a problem with the model. It can't be as precise, perhaps, as to be able to pick up this sort of surface effect. So we were unable to be more precise than to say that at a slightly more macro level, it did not affect, as I said earlier, the overall outcome. Now, whether or not it did cause locally, the pumps turning on did cause a reduction, I don't know. I can understand that it might. If you think about how pumps work, they have to have some water over their inlet in order to pump. Once they've got some water over the inlet and they turned on, they can start to draw the water down. If the water that's in the sewer immediately upstream of them is a limited volume, then they can empty that sewer quite quickly and then water can come into it. So it's entirely possible that that's what happened locally, but we could not model it. Okay? I know that doesn't sound satisfactory, but we did try. Okay? In terms of the actions, yes, there are 28, and there were 56, so we're pleased to hear we cut them down. But what we tried to do with them in the Fuller report was to look at how difficult they would be from institutional perspective or timing, and to prioritise them a little bit in terms of when one was likely to happen, when one wasn't. Because we're very conscious of the fact that some of these actions will take some time to come to fruition, but some of the actions could be done relatively quickly. We did debate with the steering group, with our sort of consultation stakeholder group, whether or not we cut them down to just those ones that are possible, but felt that was really dodging the issue. We had to put in the 28. They are all necessary. We've combined some of the 56 into the 28, and we have given a certain sort of echelon to them when they're likely to happen. And we understand that Thames and the Strategic Surface Water Group are setting a programme to monitor these actions.
Thank you, Mike. I will return to members' questions, but before we do that, I just want to invite Father Paul Baggott, who I'm aware is to leave at 7:30 to ask
Thank you,
his
Chairman,
question.
for allowing me to speak early. Father Paul Baggott from St Cuthbert's, Filbridge Gardens, Earls Court, on the edge of the Countess Creek, a Grade 1 listed building which was flooded twice in July 2021, which included sewage coming into the church and damaging organ and historic fabric. And the boiler was a write-off. I haven't spoken before because I haven't been invited to this group. For some reason I was unable to be on the list, but anyway. I have three questions. One is in response to the recommendations 3.2.1, funding for flood risk schemes and sustainable drainage systems. Would this include historic buildings, or is this just residential buildings that would be included in this funding? Second question, something like a sump pump, probably a fairly limited but one recommended type of scheme, would that really be effective, or would it just putting it into the system which is already overwhelmed? Therefore, is it just a waste of money putting something like that in? And the third question, I noticed your response just earlier said that some people, some places will remain dry, or they'll try to keep them dry, and others will have to be wet. Who makes that decision? Yes, and I'm on top of the escarpment, which is, and the fourth point is that around where we are in Earls Court, there's going to be a lot of developments, and and those developments, even one of them has already had an effect on our Grade 1 listed building, but there's going to be a major development in Earls Court, and whether Thames Water and other interested parties are going to work with the developers to ensure that they don't cause flooding to the neighbourhood.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think I should be able to answer all of them. The first question you have around funding, that funding is from the Environment Agency, and as far as I know, it is restricted to residential properties. I'm not as Thames Water, we are not the source of that funding, so there may be elements of it that I don't fully understand and therefore can't fully transfer to you, but generally it is funding based on residential property flooding. Your second question around sump pumps, that is a very relevant one, and very many people have asked that of us. There are cases where a sump pump will stop flow that was coming back out of our sewer and flooding a property, be that a building, a church, an office or home. But if flow comes from the road through your front door, a sump pump is not going to save you in that case. So there are certain situations where that is very applicable and could work, and there are other situations. I don't know the specifics of your building, so I can't comment on if it's applicable to you. Your third question around what Alex mentioned earlier, there's places that we need to keep dry and places we need to keep wet. What Alex is referring to is public realm area that is not buildings and not residents. So as an example, people don't play football when it's pouring with rain, so you can have large volumes of flood water stored temporarily in a football field, because that will drain down, where you would prefer to do that as opposed to in a building. That was Alex's comment around dry or wet. And your last question was around development in Earls Court. Should be good news to you to hear that your local authority has really good and strong policies regarding surface water management. They administer those policies very strictly. We work hard to support them, and that will ensure that surface water from new development is controlled and restricted, and that it discharges at a slower rate to the sewer, which will make more capacity in the sewer network.
Who could come and visit?
We did actually request that Thames Water come via our MP to come and actually inspect this Grade 1 listed building, which is at the top of the escarpment. So when we're talking about the flooding of the undercroft, the crypt, this is actually above the level of the London Transport tube line. So this was requested repeatedly via Felicity Buchan that Thames Water would attend to be able to look at the problem. We've had a problem with insurance, we've had a problem with communication, and we would appreciate, as backup after this meeting, for somebody to come and visit the church. It is a Grade 1 listed arts and craft building, and it's taken out the boiler, and therefore the costs for the parish are considerable. Can we accept that you will make an appointment to see Father Baggott and inspect the building?
Yeah, I'd be happy to come see.
I will meet you after the meeting and we will exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll return to the topics of planning and historic buildings later on as well. I'll come back to other residents who I know have questions as well, but before we do that, I'd like to return to members. Joanna.
Thank you. I think actually Sophia Lambert has picked up one of my key ones, but I am very cognizant that in Mike Woolger's report, out of 15 boroughs, we are the only borough that had the pumps flagged as significant in terms of the impact. So rather than looking back, what I would like to do is understand more about the future. I think Thames Water has said that the pumps are slow to operate because they need to get fully wet. So I'd actually like to go a step further and say, what can we do to either upgrade them or to make them click in? Because as Sophia said, there is actually video evidence that clicks in with the timings in the report, which is when the pumping came on. And I don't, however much you can try or not try to muddle, I think there is indicative evidence that there was a link. And secondly, I'd also like to ask about the future of flip valves on that very same basis in terms of cost and effectiveness. Thank you.
I'm going to answer the question around Lots Road and the future of it. Yes, we realize it's a really old station and there are some antiquated technology there. We have a 15-year plan on how we're going to improve that. The reason that it's so long is for multiple activities. One is that because we can't interfere with the construction work of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, so we've restricted access until the Tideway Tunnel construction is complete. But having said that, we need a very large new electrical power supplier from UKPN. We have purchased that and they're busy installing that at the moment. Around about 2025 onwards, both the Tideway Tunnel construction will be complete and we can get back onto the site and the electrical supply will be in, and then we'll start a program of modernizing so that we are not so reliant on people, we are not reliant on diesel engines, and we electrify the station, which will improve the response time and give those extra 5 minutes that Mike referred to.
Thank you. And can I just ask, does that also apply to Hammersmith?
Hammersmith is fully electrified already. The concern you raised around Hammersmith was about the number of pumps in operation. Mike specified we have 9, of which 8 pumps are in operation. In general, when you design and build a pumping station, you always build some spares in because you need to take assets out to maintain them. For Hammersmith, we have 2 spares. In the time of that flooding, one of those spares was turned into operation, so we are providing more pump capacity than we were designed for that station because of the event of the rainfall. If we had the other pump in operation, we would have turned the 9th one on as well, but you have to build some redundancy in your assets, and at Hammersmith that is a 6-pump operation with 2 spares. Sorry, 7-pump operation with 2 spares. My maths is not perfect today.
Flip valves?
I'm sorry, I wasn't quite clear on what your question on flip valves was. Please would you repeat it?
So the question is, and I think Father Baggett asked it as well, is what's the value of properties fitting flip valves, and is this actually something that all residents should try to fit?
Okay, so what a flip valve is a non-return valve with a pump on it. So essentially it pumps water over an inverse U-bend so the sewer can't back up into a property. It's very effective in protecting against sewer flooding, but what it does when you have lots of them in a street is it effectively turns a gravity-based system into a pump system, which has two big impacts. One, it makes it very difficult for us to predict where and how that water is going. And two, is it can spread that risk into new areas, and therefore in protecting some people, you can put others at risk. And that is part of our challenge, is how do we identify those properties that are at highest risk and make sure they are adequately protected, whilst at the same time not putting others at risk in order to try and protect those who are highly vulnerable. So, you know, we can't stop people installing a flip themselves. What we've been doing since we kicked off our sewer flooding resilience program is a rolling program of surveys to try and identify who are those at highest risk, and then through those surveys then work out what individually and cumulatively the solutions may be for an area. It is a slow and painstaking process, and I apologise to all residents who were either had a survey or are waiting for a survey and, you know, eagerly waiting for an answer, but it's not something we can rush. Because we want to manage the risk down rather than just move it to new locations.
Councillor Jadot?
I have a question to Thames Water, which came to me. It's quite worried, actually. I put some exclamation mark. It's quite alarming. You, as a Thames Water, you're responsible for a sewer system. And it says here, Thames Water uses 1 in 30 years return period design standard for new flooding protection scheme. However, you have an older one, which is Victorian one. And I have a question, because it says here, because of the cityscaping, that old ones are not able in some areas of London to drain water flow in event of 1 in 5 years. So I would like to, from you, just to really give me a list of those areas, because it seems to those people on this list will be absolutely doomed. And I read somewhere else that even though you have flips, still 21 properties have been flooded, and you have a new list, 444 have been flooded. My question is, can I have a list of those properties in the area which cannot withstand flooding in regards to 1 in 5 years, which is absolutely shocking? And I would like to know, what have you been doing for years, let's say 5 years, in regards to increasing capacity for current sewer you have? Because we know very well it cannot cope. So what investment did you put to enlarge it, to make it more up to current climate, which means climate change and flooding coming in such event like July 12th and 25th? Thank you.
I think I'd like to start with the 1 in 5 year scenario. We need to recognise that there are varying levels of protection across London. There are new schemes like we did in Maida Vale and Westgrove Terrace, where we have built schemes and they were designed to a 1 in 30 year rainfall event, and we've got evidence to prove through modelling work that they would withstand that, and in many cases they did withstand that in much higher rainfall events. There are other areas of London where flood risk is much lower and sewer capacity is much lower. In many cases, the 1 in 5 number is often associated with a spill to the environment, so a discharge from a CSO as opposed to flooding, but there are individual cases where properties at risk of flooding in a 1 in 5 year event occur. We have, since privatisation, had a very, very large program of investment for hydraulic flooding. At its height, it was probably about £500 million over 5 years, so about £100 million a year. It does flex and vary as our regulator changes it. If you look at Thames Water's overall position with regards to the sewerage companies in England and Wales with regards to hydraulic flooding, our performance is the best of all the other water companies. So we have a track record of a fair amount of historic investment. We do have isolated cases. I know of a case not anywhere near here, but further southeast in London, where we have one property at risk of about a 1 in 7. Unfortunately, the solution to that is about 10 or 12 million pounds. That is not cost beneficial investment, and we at the moment are not proposing to fix that level of risk of flooding. So we need to recognize we have a Victorian system, we've inherited and lived with it for 300 years, we've invested in it heavily to make sure that those that are most sensitive and most vulnerable are protected from flooding, but there are the odd location where flooding is still a problem. Sometimes we can do things to mitigate it so that it becomes external only flooding and not internal to the property, or there's other little activities like that we can alleviate it, but that is the varying nature of the sewer network that we have to operate. In terms of a list of properties, unfortunately we understand flood risk to be confidential data, so it can be shared through a confidential data agreement, but we can't release it publicly because of the Data Protection Act and the legal requirements we have to comply with under the Data Protection Act.
So can we have a, let's say, list of streets where you put some money and how much you invested in regards to increasing capacity of sewer within London area, particularly on the flooded routes?
We can, but not here today. So I would need to go and collect and source that information, check that it's valid, and then release it as appropriate.
If you are able to, that would be appreciated by the
Okay,
committee.
I'll make
Thank
an
you very
action
much.
to do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I beg your pardon?
He sent that list of the streets that you've just discussed as members of public, if we ask for it?
I'll need to check the legal requirements, and I'm not sure.
Okay.
My understanding is that data like that needs to be relevant. So if you live in that street, it is relevant to you, and therefore you can request it.
Yeah.
If it's 10 roads down and you're really interested in what your friend is, then it's maybe
I
not
meant
relevant to
assuming
you,
it
and
was
so that
relevant
would
to where you
restrict
live.
it.
Yeah.
But I'm not fully up to speed with all the legal restrictions around the data release.
Sophia.
I think the council had a second point, which was about the 14 flips that failed in July. What we've been doing is we're visiting the addresses to try and work out why those flips failed. I'm aware of the first 7 that we've been to. It was the flooding was actually due to overland flow, so the flooding wasn't actually the sewer backing up into the property. It was water coming over the ground and into the light wells and in through the windows and the doors there. I haven't got the latest on the second 7. But we are tracking those down to see, was it a mechanical fault in the flip? Was it a misdesign of the connection? Was it a loss of power to the flip because it gets its power from somewhere that had been shorted? Or was it something else like overland flow? So please rest assured we have been getting to the bottom of why they failed. And did they fail, or were they just simply bypassed by the floodwater taking another route?
Just for today, I really would like to get hold on the freedom of information, if you like, the area which you eachly stated cannot withhold in times of this kind of event, 1 in 5 years. We're talking 1 in 150 to 150 years. So I just really would like to have an area within London. And as I said again, I would like to have some kind of map or some data. Where have you put some investment into increasing sewer capacity for today? And I think this will be available under freedom of information because it's a public knowledge. It affects everybody in this room and beyond.
Could I just come in on
Sorry,
that?
it should be available under the Environmental Information Regulations. This data is not available through Freedom of Information requests. They're available through Environmental Information Regulations. We will take the requests and make sure they get processed accordingly.
Thank you, Graham. Councillor Gardner.
Could I just come in on that? Because one of the things, when somebody buys a property, any property in this borough is shown as a flood risk. But actually that is not reflective of it being a 1 in 80, a 1 in 5, or a 1 in 30. I mean, some of the data we've seen has been 1 in 30 down in Kensington, South Kensington, whereas in North Kensington it's a 1 in 80, 1 in 85, 100 years. It would be nice to be able to see that granularity, because personally, if I were buying a house, and I suspect the same for most of the residents who've been flooded today, they would like to see that level of granularity so that they can assess, you know what, I don't want to buy a house that really is at flood risk. But being told it's flood risk without that level of granularity is very helpless.
The data you're referring to, I believe, is Environment Agency data, and it is calculated through the surface water flood risk. There is additional data sources that you collect from us and you publish in your local flood risk management strategy, which determines property level flood risk in large regional areas, and the local authorities tend to colour code them. I don't recall exactly how your borough has represented the data, but every 5 years you repeat the activity. We have a standard report we release to you that normally gets mapped and added as an appendix to most flood risk management strategies, which will show relative risk of flood risk from the sewer system as opposed to from surface water.
So has that been updated since the floods?
You'll need to speak to the lead local flood authority function. I unfortunately deal with 32 London boroughs, and so I can't tell you exactly which one's up to date at all points.
I'm keen to bring in residents. Before I do, Doug, have you any thoughts on any of the questions that have been discussed so far that you'd like to share with us before we bring in residents?
Well, I think that they're clearly very relevant questions, and I think that the difficulty that Thames are explaining, I think they've done a reasonable job at explaining that situation. One of the things that I was going to mention on an earlier question, in terms of inviting the ability to communicate to residents, is Thames also operate a priority services register, and that's often utilised when there is a big burst of water, so that vulnerable residents can be contacted and maybe given bottled water, for instance. I think it's one of the ways that interagencies can approach going forward, although there are some GDPR issues in this, so that any vulnerable customers can be prioritised in terms of information provided, because clearly they are more vulnerable. So I think there are certain things that can be done, as well as general communications around. And I think, going forward, that the transparency of what Thames are going to do is important. I mean, I think the lack of trust that can emanate if there is a lack of transparency has to be overcome. And I hope that Thames will continue to try and be transparent about the approaches they're using, but also communicate in plain English, because there are a lot of acronyms that are used in the industry that are not accessible to normal, ordinary people. And I think trying to get over that is an important role that maybe the local authority can assist with in terms of the communications that will come out when your report is finalised.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to turn to residents now, and I have a number of questions that have been pre-submitted. The first one from Aleo Carson. I believe, Aleo, you're here, would like to read your question?
It links to the Lots Road question you asked, and if I could ask if Mike could be linked in. Mike came, as did I and many people here tonight, to the October meeting last year, which was the biggest, the first and the biggest of the meetings. Thames Water was there, George Mayhew was there then. And I sat roughly here, and next to me was a water engineer with knowledge of Lots Road, by chance. He said categorically it was a manual pump that was pulled down at 5 o'clock in the evening. Now, we all know when the flood began, and that's not minutes, Mike, from what you said. So I can't understand the connection between Mike's comments of their findings of the independent review, that the pump was indeed somewhat delayed, but it was a very short period of time, with this water engineer guy who knew his stuff, knew Lots Road, claiming categorically 5 o'clock. Now, it's on the video. Mike was here for the meeting. I was, and some of you were. So it just doesn't marry, and I don't understand. I wonder if any comment from that.
Mike, do you want to come in first before we go to Thames Water?
I think I heard the question. Going back to Lots Road, what we understood that there was a lot of noise around the fact that Lots Road was not got to perform properly. So we did try to model it, as I said earlier. We asked Thames for the information that they could provide us around the operational records of what happened, or when it happened, and how it happened. We got that eventually. It is not a printout from a computer because it is still manually operated, but that was the best that we could get. We used that, and it did not show a huge offset in time. That is the data I have. I don't know who your source is, and I didn't speak to that person, so I can't cross-verify it. But I got information from Thames. I trusted it. If we want to go over that again and have a look at that information, I'm sure Thames will provide it to us. What you have to remember, as I said earlier, that the pumps only work if there's water for them to pump. So turning a pump on really early doesn't work. Turning it on when there's water does. I do think the pumps came on a bit late, but it wasn't a huge offset according to the information that I was provided with.
Thank you, Mike.
Do the next bit of it, which is, am I right in thinking that the Thames Water people commissioned the independent review? I think I'm right. Am I right? So that is somewhat strange that Thames Water commissioned the report of the review of the tragedy that, I know Thames Water's denied liability, I know that, but you would think they might have, its independent review might have been commissioned by a totally independent body.
A response?
To answer the point about
In terms of
the pumping.
In terms of what I was asked to do, I was asked to set a terms of reference, which I did, and Thames accepted it. I then set a programme for what I wanted and information, and Thames gave me the information. It was as independent as I could make it. Yes, we were paid for by Thames Water. I'm not sure what other body could have commissioned it. And yes, we understand that people are suspicious, but I tried to make it as independent as I could.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to turn to Thames Water to respond as well. Thanks.
I mean, there's not really much I can add to that. So with regards to Lots Road, we provided the independent expert group who led the independent review with the raw data of both the site layout, the operating protocols, the timesheets of when the pumps were turned on. Because it is a diesel pump, it is manually operated. It is not linked into our computer, what's called SCADA system, that measures and records everything, and therefore it has to be this manual entry. We provided all of that raw data to Mike and the team, and in an effort to be as transparent as possible. So their conclusions are their conclusions. I take your challenge that yes, with us paying the expert group, there could be the perception of bias, if you want to call it that. But we went to the nth degree to make sure that they set their agenda. We teamed them with a set of independent of consultants. They appointed them. They decided who was appointed. I merely just signed off the invoices. So in the absence of anyone else stepping forward and wanting to spend that money, and it was a lot of money, that was the best we could make it. Independent experts, independent steering group of which Doug sat on to make sure that we weren't feeding the witness, and an independent report. I would, if people felt we could have done this better, I'm happy to learn those lessons. But I think at the time we did the best we could.
Thanks.
Thank you. Is Mr. Bobby Vincent Emery present?
Chairman, apologies, Mrs. Yeah, that's my mistake. I have to apologise for that.
No worries. Thank you. Bobby Vincent Emery? No.
But I could possibly respond on her behalf. I'm her neighbour, so
sure,
we
go ahead.
came up with these questions together. My name's Edward Mallory. I think the issue is, for us is, OK, we've discussed Lots Road a lot. All I can say from the point of view of our building, which is 42 flats right on the junction of Addison Upper Addison Gardens, where the sewer overflowed, the Thames Water model in the independent review suggested that the flood would be between 100 and 200 millimetres less had Lots Road come on more quickly. Well, that's the sort of depth we had in the road outside our block. But because our block is built in a hollow, as it were, about 4.5 metres of water accumulated at the bottom of our building in our basement and lower ground. So that 100 or 200 millimetres was translated into 4.5 metre flood in our property. So even these small things at the road level can make a huge difference if they're allowed to flow into a property. So really what we need to do is to know what Thames Water is going to do about this sewer overflow flooding. Do you have a solution? Can you help properties like us protect ourselves? What height of flood defences should we put around? We have a big pump system at the moment. It's not really arranged as a flip would be arranged, but could somebody have a look at it and advise us? We've only had some surveyors from Thames Water to look at go enter the sewer and look at our sewer connections so far. We haven't really had any technical advice, and this must be one of the very worst buildings affected in the borough, with 4.5 metres of flood in it. And we're still rebuilding it. We're still at a reconstruction phase. Millions of pounds worth of money has been spent on repairs.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with that, then my colleague Graham can fill in any gaps. So, first of all, sorry for your flooding. I mean, we are legally responsible for sewer flooding, so water flooding that comes out through the sewer connection or out of our sewer network. However, as I started my introduction, the sewer network and the surface water flooding are highly intricated between the two systems across London, and particularly in the Counters Creek, Lost River area, where, so what we're doing is we're working where there clearly was causes of sewer flooding, and we identify a higher risk to customers to fix that. We are also supporting the borough as the lead local flood authority, who have that responsibility for the surface water flooding, to look at the longer term solutions there, because it's important that we aren't just looking at one type of flooding, as they are so integrated. I think what we need, the next step we need to understand is where, as in instances in your locality where flooding erupts out of our system and adds to surface water flooding, creating a greater depth of flooding that causes a real problem to buildings, how do we identify and prioritise those? Because at the moment, we have a sewer flood model that tells us how full our sewers are and where they come out, and the local authority has a surface water model that tells them where water runs to and how deep it's going to get. We need to bring those two together to say, where does the combined flooding create additional or new risk, and ensure that collectively we develop plans to manage those hotspots. Now, when we have these truly exceptional events, the problem is the whole of that catchment needs to be considered. You can't just take an individual hotspot, because A, you won't be sustainably solving it, because the solution may lay well outside your area. But we are committed to work with the local authority in identifying these hotspots and then working out who is best placed to deliver those solutions.
Can I bring Mike in on this as well? Mike, I'd be interested to hear your views on this. We've heard actually a small amount of water can actually have quite interesting and consequential side effects there, and also the combination of surface and sewer water in certain areas. What are your thoughts on these?
Well, I did actually visit with Mr. Mallory at Addison Gardens, and I did see the damage. It is quite remarkable. I did make the point earlier on that, although 100 millimetres means that it doesn't change the overall effect, but it does have impacts on those who would not otherwise have flooded. They sort of flood for the first time, and that may well have been the case for Addison Gardens, because the house, the block of flats is on a corner. The water flowed down out of Holland Park, I think, down the road, round that corner, and the first thing it comes to is a driveway that goes down into the basement. And it went down that basement. I don't know whether there was backing up from the sewers. I can't remember whether there was a particular problem with flooding directly from the sewer, but certainly there was a lot of surface water that came in. And I met Mr. Mallory at the site, and we looked at, what could one do about raising the pavement locally, just to stop the water, which will always flow in that direction when it's on the surface. It will flow down that hill. It has to. Is there anything you could do with managing the pavement locally, which would be acceptable to the local authority? I don't know where that question got to, but yeah, there are those effects where that 100 millimetre can make all the difference to one particular property or to several properties. The other question you asked, Mr. Chairman, about integrating surface water and underground pipe models. Yes, it's really important to try to do that, and we did that in our study in some areas. One of the models, if you like, the cities that we looked at with Lykke Leonardsen, who was one of the members of the expert group, she comes from Copenhagen, and there they have done a program over the last 10 years to ensure that they do have these integrated models and that the design of surface and underground systems is well coordinated. Copenhagen is a very much smaller town, so they've got a bit of a start on us, and they've only got one local authority, not 33. Nonetheless, it does not stop the point that we do need to have these integrated models. We need to have systems which are capable of talking to each other. They don't need to be 33 local authorities worth of surface models integrated directly with an underground pipe model to start with, because it's quite clear there are particular areas of London which are at risk. They are the ones which are at the bottom of the hills in the old river valleys, if you like, the Westbournes, the Countess Creeks, the Brook Roads, the Fleet Streets. These are all old rivers, and so we can prioritise where these models are integrated. It needs to happen. It hasn't happened, and at the moment there's quite a lot of guesswork going on. One of the things that we did was we got a 2D, a surface water flow model, which we could link in certain locations to the groundwater, to the underground pipe model, in order to test with more precision in some areas how the surface and underground pipes responded together. We couldn't do it for the whole of London. There's not enough computing power available to us at that level of discrimination. But over time, we do need to build these conjoint models. It's essential. We can't work otherwise. It's just guesswork.
Thank you very much, Mike. Bobby, Vincent, and we asked also a couple of other questions which are addressed more to the council. So, Bobby, if you are listening, we will definitely get answers to those and help that contribute to our recommendation. I will make sure you also receive them. One of the other questions was Lots Road pumping station. I think we've covered already. And we've talked about sewer capacity as well. I might press a little bit more on sewer capacity in terms of plans for work on some of these areas that you've identified. Is that already being scheduled? What can you update us on that?
Yes, so we do have fairly detailed plans, long-term plans for sewer investment work, and that's the third topic of discussion today, the drainage and wastewater management plans. There's probably an element of explanation I need to do just around them and what they are and how they work. The framework to build drainage and wastewater management plans was first released in September 2019. It is a very comprehensive first-pass document of how water companies would do a drainage and wastewater management plan. All sewerage companies in England and Wales have committed to do them, and we've done them and released a draft. In that process, we've learned a lot because we've never had to do them before. They will become statutory when the Environment Act enacts them in a few years' time, and then we will do them as part of a statutory function, and we expect there'll be an enhancement to the framework over that time. What's important to note about the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan is it's not about your local street or your local neighbourhood. It is a 25 or longer year strategic plan of what type of investment is needed to accommodate the effects of population growth and urban creep on the drainage system. For that reason, it is a big strategic plan and doesn't tell you which pipe, exactly how big it needs to be, in which calendar year we're going to do it in. It tells you that this is the impact that population growth and climate change will have on our sewer network. We forward forecast that up to 2050, and then we propose solutions to mitigate that. We tend to roll those solutions up and provide them in very large areas because of the level of uncertainty around the modelling. As Mike has mentioned, the modelling is complicated. The modelling work for the drainage and wastewater management plans across our Thames Water operational region took us about a year, and some of the processing times just for the model in London, there were some of the activities that it took 3 weeks of computer processing just to get an answer. So they are very complex models. They are very advanced. We've spent millions of pounds developing them. They are not yet exactly where we want to be them. We'd love them to be further on, but we've got a bit of a technological restriction into how fast we can go. We do not at the moment have processing power that is easily accessible and readily available to us that can just run 2D simulations across the whole of London and predict that data. We'd love to have it. We'd absolutely love it. And I'm sure our colleagues in lead local flood authorities would benefit and use that data as well.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time and considering the way the conversation has gone, I think we've covered quite a lot of the other agenda items. What I'm going to do is sort of combine the other two. And I'm keen to get residents involved as well and continue on with discussions. Is Kumar Devadasan here? Mr. Devadasan?
Hi, Mike, thank you for all the technical discussions we had. And you were very kind to give me some data. And applying that data, which was the amount of water estimated in the area and the pumping capacity of the 2 Lots Road pumps, we calculated that it would take 33 minutes to drain that water. And we know from the reply, the letter from Thames Water, that those pumps were turned on at 16:45 and 1700. And the residents in the area, bar none, saw the effects, observed the effects, that the water was drained within half an hour of the time. So the water was drained between 1717 and 1735. So that fits in with that calculation. Secondly, in the Thames Water internal review dated in November 2021, you stated that you hadn't sent a person to the Lots Road because you were relying on the central forecast of the yellow alert from the Met Office. But the thing is, the central forecast would have been accompanied by the extreme forecast, which would have covered the heavier rainfall. The thing is that no impact assessment was made if that low probability event had happened. However, now we have an impact assessment. I was wondering if you would change your operational procedure to look at the extreme forecast and turn the pumps on sooner, if it was possible. If you could give us that assurance, I'd be most grateful.
It sounds to me like Mike needs to answer the first question, and I can certainly answer your second one, as I've got the mic on, and I'll do that now. So yes, so since we've commissioned that internal review, 2 reviews. The internal review looked at our emergency response on the day and immediately following, and what could we have learned and done better. So since that, we've now developed what we call a hydraulic playbook. But really what that means is an improved emergency plan for where there is uncertainty about flooding. So now when we have a yellow weather warning, such as we had on the 12th and the 25th, we act as though it is the worst one. So we look at what would be the likely impact if that was actually a red warning or a higher. We look at the more extreme rainfall and we take preemptive measures on that. So yes, we have learned from that, we have applied that, and that is one of the key lessons. The other being is that we need to be much more present with the local authorities in supporting them and the other emergency responders in managing these incidents. So just to reassure you, I'll let Mike answer your question about the mathematical computation about pumping times, volumes, and etc.
Can I bring Mike in, if you could help with that question? Thank you, Mike.
I didn't hear the question very clearly, but I understand it was to do with
if I may,
the Lots Road issue again. I haven't really got much more to say on that. As I said, we did try to model all sorts of different operating modes, and we used the operating information that we were given. And within the constraints of what we have in terms of the model, we were unable to demonstrate anything particularly sensitive in that area, because we don't have particularly highly discriminating models in that area. So I can't really add anything to that, I'm afraid. I guess this is something that that Thames could probably, with more data, have a better idea of than I have. But I have not got that information to hand, and I'm afraid I can't really add anything more to it at the moment.
It wasn't really a question.
Alex.
It wasn't really a question, Mike. I was just thanking you for the data.
Okay.
And from that data, we got that particular timing. So, all right, it's not a complicated modeling issue, but the result coincided with the timing observations that were made by all residents in the area. So that's it. The main thing was the question which has been answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we have a number of questions. I can name, we have a question from Marion Gettelson and Jacqueline Pruskin and several other residents who have asked about the Thames Water surveys that were done early in the post-flood period. And the common question we have there is that they haven't heard anything since. Would you be able to tell us a bit about what these surveys entailed, what their purpose is, and what the expectation should be from residents? Because this is a question that we've heard quite a lot from residents in RBKC.
Certainly. So the point of what we call our sewer flooding resilience programme is to understand who was affected and how. So of all the properties that were connected to our combined sewer, how were they flooded, where they've reported flooding to us, what was the root of it, how were they affected, how quickly did it rise, etc. To understand their sewer connection or connections. So properties can have different levels of connectability to our sewers and which sewers they were connected to. The internal floor layout of the basement property, so basically where would the water erupt from if it came from our sewers, and then also sort of the vulnerability of the residents, because as Mr. Taylor was saying, we've got to prioritise our most vulnerable residents first, and then also to understand what sort of space in the front of the property or in the road space is there if we were to implement a solution. So that's the point of the surveys, understand the risk, try and be able to understand what is the risk of that property flooding again in the future, what is the vulnerability of the residents to it, and what are the options in terms of size and space and depth of sewer connections to be able to then implement a solution. What we've done, certainly within RBK, the Kensington Chelsea, is that we've written to 613 properties. So of the 162 of those are properties who had previously reported flooding to us, and 451 properties were properties we think might have flooded but haven't yet reported to us. So we looked at, well, that's strange, number 3 and number 5 flooded, why didn't number 7 report anything to us? That kind of approach. So we make sure that we are proactively reaching out and encouraging people to report flooding where perhaps they don't know who to report to or how to do it. Of those, we've now had 162 properties have reported flooding, 335 properties reported flooding to us. 162 of those were people who had previously agreed flooding and now have a survey booked, and 173 were ones who've since come out with us reaching out to them. So we've got these 335 properties that we are trying to get a survey arranged for. 186 properties have done that, so they have a survey, and 156 of those surveys have now been undertaken. So it is quite a large process, and that is just for this borough, but we started the programme in this borough, so we've obviously got the highest sort of totals to go forward. So what we're now doing is we're now crunching that data to say, well, okay, why did this property flood? What is the depth of its sewer connection? What are the likely solutions that we can implement? Remembering that we are focused here on sewer flooding, so the connection between the sewer and the property. And what do we think is the chance of it flooding again? And then when we add those up in a neighbourhood, we then say, out of the options we've got to protect those properties, if we were to cumulatively install all of them, would that nudge flood risk into a neighbouring area? And therefore, does that water that's now no longer going into those properties need to be managed in another way? Because as I said in my opening speech, we want to manage the risk down, not just shuffle it around London. So where we are with these properties is we've got a large number of surveys undertaken, we're designing the solutions now for those, and we're assessing the future risk for those at highest risk so we can prioritise those.
Does that mean that individual properties or individual residents who have brought you in and allowed you to do the survey will receive an individualised set of recommendations for their property? Is that something they should expect?
Yes, our aim is to provide probably a more simplified report than the technical reports we're receiving to sort of say, this is why we think you flooded, this is how the flood water entered, where we don't think there's anything we can do for that property because it wasn't sewer flooding, some support on how to recommend protecting the property itself through other measures, and where we plan to undertake measures, the timeline for what we're going to do.
Okay, because at the time, many residents were told that they would receive reports in 4 to 6 weeks. Is that the same thing that you're referring to? And if so, why were they told at the time that it was 4 to 6 weeks?
Well, we've got a lot of properties on our plate. We've got an awful lot of properties that reported flooding. The reporting uptake was very large, so we've had to accommodate all those things, and we're trying to create this efficient rolling program. So we're doing our best to get those reports out and to design solutions that we can then get our contractors to come out and deliver. But as I said, we do need to understand this cumulative impact, and we've struggled to get past about 65% reporting of customers who reported flooding signing up for a survey. So we've written to customers 3 times where we have an email or a mobile phone number. We've sent texts, we've done door knocking, we've engaged with local social media groups where they're like Facebook pages for friends of residents associations, etc. But we seem to be stuck at this 65% figure of struggling to get those remaining customers to fix a survey with us. We are at that stage where we may have to just move on and then develop solutions for those who've had the survey and are at highest risk, because we recognise that it's delaying the solutions for those who have gone through the process.
Okay, thank you. Before I return to residents, I'd like to invite members if there are any other questions, and then it'll be just residents.
Thank you. If I can follow up, because so one of my residents had her survey done in July and has heard nothing since. She was told she'd get the survey in 6 weeks. I also know that I joined you, Alex, and indeed Andrew Hagger and a number of other people last November, so November 2021, going around 10 businesses and residential houses. And I know you then went on to Norland and went through a number of houses, indeed some in the audience today. What's been the follow-up with those? And in lots of cases I hear that actually, yes, Thames Water came and looked, and then nothing. And there's that complete lack of communication, and the residents feel really disappointed. Why can't you at least send out a holding letter or, thank you, we saw you, this is what's happening? I've had people who've reported through Thames Water online, and they keep being asked to resubmit the same documents. They say, we can't find your document, we can't find your disclosure. Thames Water's communications, could we please ask that to be improved?
I think that's a very fair request, yes. If you're aware of anyone who is in limbo and we've not heard from us, please let me know their addresses, and I will make sure that we get at least a holding letter out. The process is taking longer than we anticipated, but we should not be leaving customers hanging like that. We should at least be able to give them a heads up of where they are in that process.
Do you happen to know if the 10 businesses in Elgin Crescent were actually followed up? That was last November.
I will have to check. I'm sorry. We've got hundreds and over 1,000 properties. I couldn't confidently tell you that.
And when you talk about properties, it's both residential and commercial properties.
Correct, yes. If it was flooded, it doesn't matter if it was a home or a business or a church or whatever, they would be treated the same.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wade.
In the past, I think the last presentation I saw from Thames Water was before 2017, and you centred on the area around Addison Road with SUDS treatment on the roads and flips. What's significant about this is the fact that the flooding incidents have happened far further south. So you had flooding in the Barrett's development, which was between Tesco's and High Street Ken, and significantly you had flooding in Earl's Court, which has previously never experienced flooding. Now, there are 2 issues here. You've had flooding with surface water, and you've had flooding from sewage. Now, in the flooding in the Barrett's development, now Barrett's are very experienced people when they come to developing. They've been doing it for a long time. So the one question I would ask was whether or not we have to re-examine how we assess flood risk assessment when it comes to climate change, how we're assessing it is outmoded. We have change of weather patterns. We have increased building. and we're going to, and I'll touch on the Earls Court Exhibition Centre site but slightly later. But the issue is that Barrett's build, and they were flooded up to the ground floor, and I saw the pictures and people had to get decanted. Some of the residents in Kendall House were decanted for up to 6 months in hotels. So this clearly didn't work. Now, in Earls Court, you had the church, which is, as we say, was at the top of the escarpment, and therefore should not have been impacted by sewage. Sainsbury's Local, which is on Earls Court Road, which is really quite far in to the Earls Court ward, was actually flooded by sewage. So question 2 is, who's responsible for clearing the drains? And third question, who's responsible for clearing the gullies? So then you come to the concept of this development in Earls Court and whether or not the design of the sewage is actually to the capacity to be able to address the volume of waste that is coming from Brent, Camden, wherever, down this system, because the common feature of this is Counters Creek. So Counters Creek will have touched on the sites between Tesco's and High Street Ken, and remember we've got the build coming with 100 West Cromwell Road with the 28-storey tower and a fillet going back on the, along the railway track. You've got Cluny Mews, which is being built at the moment. You've got 4,600 homes on the Earls Court site. You've got workspace for 12,000 to 15,000 people on that site, on the 42-acre site. So whether it's Hammersmith and Fulham drainage, Lots Road drainage, whether it's Westbourne, do we actually have a system that has the capacity to be able to deal with climate change? And why, when you have an opportunity with an empty site in Earls Court, aren't you trying to address and provide sufficient drainage? And if you can't guarantee it, should you not be trying to control the numbers on that site? Thank you.
I think I'd like to start with some comments about the rainfall. You would expect flooding to be different across different time events because the rainfall happens differently, and what you can note very clearly from the extreme flooding we had in July 2007 to the flooding we had in July 2021, there's a very big spatial variation with them. We don't have the radar data for 2007 because there was a lightning strike and radar requires no lightning to give you an accurate data, so we have irregular patchy data. But if you look at the performance of the sewer system over those two scenarios, you'll see a distinct difference. Counters Creek flooded in 2007 and the Counters Creek sewer was severely affected. In 2021, your primary cause of flooding was via the northwest storm relief sewer. The interesting element is those two bisect each other, and so customers and properties that overlay where both of those are located flood twice. The key element to understand that is if you look at the 2007 flooding in Counters Creek, large portions of Fulham flooded, where in this 2021, there was hardly any flooding in Fulham. The spatial variation of rainfall was different, that affected the pipework, and we had a different flooding in different locations. So what your comment around why we've had a variation is really well understood. It was assessed by the independent review, it was assessed prior to that by ourselves, and we understand that there's a spatial variation, difference in rainfall, despite a massive intensity difference as well. That affected different levels of pipe, and therefore we saw different elements of flooding. When it comes to redevelopment, redevelopment is a significant benefit to flood risk. And that is because you have an exceptionally strong local plan policy regarding surface water flood management. You implement that policy exceptionally well. You're one of the best boroughs in London to do that. And that means that when you look at the flow coming off an undeveloped site, it is exceptionally high. As soon as that site is developed, the foul water element of course increases because there's more people living there. But the surface water element dramatically decreases. And if you look at the net effect of the foul and the surface water elements, there is a significant decrease in the speed at which the water comes off the development sites. So all development is doing us a favour and reducing our flood risk downstream of it. That is more relevant in areas where we have a combined sewer like here, compared to places like Brent and Twickenham where you have a separate sewer system, because it doesn't quite work.
Can I ask why residents further south weren't offered the option of flip systems where they considered previously not to be vulnerable to flood?
Were not offered systems in from the 2007 flooding or from the 2021 flooding? Because following 2007, and there was, I mentioned 2007 as a date, but there was a bit more in 2008. It was around about that time. We did install about 1,800 flip devices based on properties that had reported flooding, or like Alex said, properties that we believed were at risk because we'd put a flip in. So there are a lot of residents where they didn't flood, but because their neighbour flooded, we put one in just in case by putting a flip in your neighbour's property, we would have increased the risk to yours. We put one in as well.
But would you consider that given climate change that we should be re-evaluating our risk, flood risk assessments?
Most definitely. Not in terms of your planning policy, because I think your planning policy is good and it works to a 1 in 100 year rainfall event, but the whole reason we have a drainage and wastewater management plan is because climate change is hitting, and it's going to create devastating effects if we do nothing about it with regards to flood volume. And so we have a drainage and wastewater management plan. It's the first start of it. It will be revised every 5 years. We'll get better forecasts on what climate change is predicted to do. We'll start implementing solutions in high-risk areas. That's the intent behind the drainage and wastewater management plan.
Thank you, Councillor. We'd like to bring Mike into some of these questions, actually. In particular, Mike, would you be able to tell us a bit about large-scale development and what you think should be done, both in terms of surface water management, but also the sewers as well, touching on what Councillor Wade put in her question. Thank you.
Okay, I sort of found it quite hard to hear Graham, but I think what he was saying is pretty much what I would say. Where you have a large new development, provided the local authority, in Earl's Court, your case, is able to enforce the requirement to reduce runoff from the site, that is definitely a benefit. We should be taking every opportunity we can to control flows out of these previously impermeable areas, paved areas, making sure that we hold the water back where we can, because it does provide, as Graham said, I think he said, it does provide some benefits to the management of floods which come out of the sewer, because we stop the water going into the sewer in the first place. In terms of sewage, yes, one of the things that Thames Water has to do is it has to check the capacity of their sewers to take the foul sewage from these new developments. In principle, the sewers are sized massively larger than you'd need for sewage alone. They're principally sized for taking storm flows anyway. So there's generally enough capacity for more foul sewage, particularly in the large trunk sewers. The sort of feeder sewers that go into trunk sewers may need to be upsized, and that's something that Thames would have to look for. But in terms of the overall capacity of the main sewers, they are considerably in excess of what you need for foul sewage, because they are combined sewers and they are primarily designed to take rainwater in terms of capacity.
Thank you, Mike. Lady.
Hello, Miss Marshall, Stoneleigh Place, Nottingdale Ward. Could you just tell me what your current system capacity is, please?
It is exceptionally variable. It is depending on the pipe in your road where you live.
Okay. You said you had a 25-year sewer and drainage plan.
Yes.
Due to lack of resources, lack of people? Why does it take 25 years? Why is it going to take 25 years?
We said 25 years as the extent of the climate change scenarios we analysed. So we could have done for 10 years and said, how is climate change going to affect this area in 10 years? We could have done 15 years. The guidance in the Drainage and Wastewater Management Plan framework says do a minimum of 25. So we've gone for 25. The work we're doing in future, we'd like to extend that. That is not the extent of time in which we require to implement the solutions. That's the risk position in 2050 due to climate change that we're assessing.
What Graham means is it's a plan for 25 years, not it's going to take 25 years to do it.
Why is it going to take 15 years to upgrade Lots Road?
There's loads of constraints on the site. So the first one is we can't get there because Tideway are busy working at the moment, and so there's no space. That's why we've purchased the power, because we can do that now and we can get that ahead of time. It may not take a full 10 years, it may take 6, it may take 7, but because we work in 5-year regulatory periods, we've allocated the next 2 regulatory periods to account for investment in Lots Road. But the exact time it depends will be down to how long it takes us to get the activity through planning, what type of additional design we need to do, what type of access we have, restrictions to get heavy machinery.
So it could take longer than 15 years?
It shouldn't take longer than 15 years. We've gone for a very conservative estimate. My anticipation it would be less than 15 years. And 15 years starting in 2020.
Okay. And you say it's a 30 to 40 year event that this sort of thing happens, but my house was flooded in 2007, 15 years ago, with half the amount of floodwater, so about 6 inches to this time, events 12 inches.
The probability is determined by an independent organisation called the CEH, Centre for Sorry, I just forgot it. Centre for Environment and Hydrology. They take national rainfall intensity data and they convert it and they release a handbook called the Flood Estimation Handbook, and that is the probability data we use. It's not something we predict ourselves. They refresh that on a routine basis. They haven't refreshed it for a few years. At the moment, we're using a 2013 version, but they did refresh it prior to that, I think, in 2009.
In relation to the surveys, do you know everybody that was flooded?
We know we have a long list of all the properties that have been reported to us as flooded. That list has been compiled from those who directly reported to us, from local authorities such as this one who've added on additional properties, and from other sources, London Fire Brigade, etc. We certainly do not think it is comprehensive, and that is why we've written to those additional properties we think may have flooded, to try and encourage people to report and to make sure that it's clear. That's why we attend sessions like this, so people know to tell us that they flooded, so they can be part of that register. But I would not say that we know everyone, and I would say, yeah, we're probably out by quite a fair way still, and that is why we're going to keep asking and keep pursuing people to report.
Because I didn't receive a letter or no one knocked on my door at all, and the whole process was very disorganised, but you said you have a resilient plan for this sort of thing. So why wasn't that implemented straight after the flood? Why didn't you come around? Why weren't we sent letters straight away? We had to come to this, create these meetings, come to these meetings, fill out these stupid questionnaires that made not much sense and stuff. And can you have a dedicated flood phone line for these things to happen in the future?
So, I mean, we have been coming to these meetings since October, you know, to make sure that people are aware who to report to. It is unclear, and, you know, that's one of the things we've already got to work on collectively with all local authorities and all emergency planners is, if the water is coming out of your sewer, out of your toilet or your shower, call Thames. If it's coming under your front door, call your local authority. If you're at risk of life, call the fire brigade. You know, that knowledge is just not common knowledge, and it needs to be much more common than it is now. We're doing our bit to try and see how we can help people who are flooded from our sewer, and we're working with the local authorities to help manage that bigger picture of these huge events where it just comes from everywhere. It is not where it needs to be, and I absolutely take your criticism, but we are working to make it better.
Do you have a dedicated flood line right now?
No, because what we have is a customer contact centre.
Because when I rang that, they didn't know anything about this flood and the surveys and anything. They had not a clue.
Apologies. Maybe that is. We have briefed all of our customer contact agents to be able to answer this. We have a dedicated email address to receive these queries on, and I'm happy to meet you afterwards and feel if you haven't received a letter to make sure you get one.
My last question is just the surveys that have been done already. I have had my survey done. I had to tell my neighbours. They just came out and saw what was happening. They had no idea. When are we going to get an answer to what can be done in our properties, please?
I will have to go back and check. I don't know what the independent of your property, what the survey found and what it finds in your neighbourhood to be able to say what is the right solution and how quickly can be implemented. But, I'll get your address and I will get back to you on that.
But for everybody else as well, is it going to take a number of years before we can see some solutions?
Right. Our aim is to have completed all surveys across all properties by the end of this year, maybe into early January, and for the highest risk properties to have implemented solutions before the summer storm season next year.
Thank you very much.
That doesn't mean everyone is going to get everything they want. As I stress, we will be prioritising the highest risk properties first.
I'd like to bring in the gentleman at the end.
Thank you. Tim Darvell, Addison Crescent in Holland Ward. I've got sort of one question for Thames Water and just a couple of quick observations. My question is that I'm unfortunate enough to live in an area where there are massive numbers of major developments going on at basement level. These are very big civil engineering projects, and every day, which I imagine is probably part of the council's CTMP requirements, the pavements and the road are washed down. And that means a lot of dirt and stuff is going into the sewers, into the gullies, which I assume then feed into the sewers. I'd like to know from Thames Water whether this is something they're aware of, what the extent of the problem is, but that certainly quite a lot of soil going and other stuff going down into the drains on that occasion. My observations are just to say that I'm one of the people who had a relatively low level of water within our property, which would be about 10 centimetres, and it went down very suddenly at or just before 5 o'clock. So I'm certainly interested in hearing more about Lots Road. We've talked about it plenty, but I still don't understand quite how literally within a matter of minutes all the water disappeared in the case of our property, but it did. And that is when I believe the Lots Road was turned on. I also wanted just to come back on the question of people being notified, there being a notification source. The Environment Agency has apparently set up a flood warning system which you can register with. I registered with it. We had some pretty frightening forecasts for major rain in August of this year, or maybe it was July as well, and certainly received no notifications, maybe because the trigger point wasn't hit. All I'm really saying is that I'm getting some satisfaction that we're going to be notified if there's a major downpour, but I'm not now, after this meeting, feeling very confident that if they're relying on the meteorological office, whether it's going to mean anything, whether I'm going to be able to do anything in time. So I do think if there is a system, rather than giving people false hope that we're going to get notified, that someone actually has looked at that and it actually is a meaningful system to have in place.
So, picking up your first question, building rubble being washed into our sewers, are we aware? Probably not at a local level. I'm not even sure if people are, if a developer is allowed to wash stuff into a sewer. I would severely doubt that that is the case. But what we do is we have a model that, I know the answer for everything seems to be a model at the moment, but what we do is we have a system that tries to identify where are blockages most likely to occur and to preemptively clean the sewers to make sure they have that capacity to take the flows. I will go back and speak to the team to see if anything we can do to identify these high development areas. But the whole point of these big developments is that they're supposed to clean all their trucks and everything before they come off the development site, so they don't carry rubble onto the road and into the drainage system. So it'd be interesting to get your address, sir, afterwards. And, you know, if you can point us towards these, because it'd be useful, I think, for our network engineers maybe to go and have a word with the site foreman about that. We do often find large amounts of concrete blocking our system, and they are a nightmare to clean because you effectively have to dig the sewer out, and therefore it is a practice we strongly discourage. Lots Road, I think, yes, we've discussed that a lot. It's making me think that perhaps we need to do a study that looks at when was the start of the storm, what is the pumping capacity, just like Mr. Deverson was saying, and therefore can that system have pumped enough sufficient water, timing with the end of the storm, to explain that sudden drop in water. I will have a word with Mike and the team to see if there is an appetite to undertake that. On the notification system, yes, we all work on the basis of the Met Office's forecast, which also goes to the Met Office and the Environment Agency have a shared centre called the Flood Forecasting Centre, and they're the ones who calculate the damage likelihood from a flood. And that is the system we're all reliant upon. In defence of the Met Office, these convective storms are very, very difficult to predict where they're going to fall and how much water they're going to drop, which is why you get those yellow forecasts that essentially cover the whole of the southeast of England. I mean, we could not prioritise any areas on the back of that other than to look at where we've got known risk areas, known constrictions, known invasive works going on in our sewers, and that's what our response is planned around. Thank you. Gentlemen.
Is it working? Good evening. So mine's like a personal story, because my name is Nicholas Burton, and I live on the watercourse for the Countess Creek. And for the last 3 years, my cellar has been filled with sewage. So I've had to personally get people to pump it out. The fire brigades come several times, Thames Water's come, and it's still to this day full of sewage, which is on the Countess Creek watercourse. And on your website, I know I had a flood, of course, in 21. On your website for RBKC, it says about that you guys are responsible between Thames Water and RBKC for, of course, flooding. But 3 years, my first flood was in 2019, and it's still there. I've had people come round, have a little look, and they still don't know where the water's coming in. They haven't done a proper survey, and it's really affecting my mental health, because my house smells of sewage. And not just my mental health, I'm a survivor from Grenfell Tower, so I already lost my home, my wife died, I've had to go through a lot of therapy and other stuff, and I'm still living in a house that is absolutely covered. I'm not inside the house, but the cellar is still full of sewage to this day, and it goes between a couple of inches up to 4 foot, and all my electrics, if I need to do something to the electrics, they're all down in the cellar. The cock stop for the water, down in the cellar, and I can't personally go wading around in sewage. So I'm being pushed from pillar to post over the last 3 years between RBKC and Thames Water, and not one person's come up with a solution to find out where the sewage is coming into my cellar. I mean, it's incredible. So I don't probably have you guys have an answer for that, but that's just one case study that needs to be resolved.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for telling us your story. Obviously, it is a specific case. I'm sure you won't know the details, but in general, with this sort of problem, what would the problem likely be, given what the gentleman has described, and what would Thames Water's role be in trying to resolve?
I suspect. I mean, I'm really hoping that you're already on our records, and we're dealing with your case. So I will be more than happy to see you afterwards and get your details and make sure that is so. Yes, we need to do a survey of your property and understand what is it, whether there's a blockage, a misconnection, something is clearly awry, and if it's sewage, it is our responsibility. So we've got to take ownership of that. So apologies for what you're experiencing, and please can we have a chat at the end?
Yeah, because somebody came from Thames Water, but I think I asked them, are you come to help me to find out where it's from? But I just believe they just come to mitigate that it wasn't their problem. And then they just threw it back to RBKC. It's been 3 years that I've had this problem, but we'll have a chat.
Well, I will follow up with your case, sir, and if you can give me your name, I'll make sure that we get to the bottom of what it is, and if it is not our responsibility to make sure that we don't just pass it to you to get sorted out or to speak to the proper authorities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other residents who would like to speak or ask a question?
Can I ask a personal question? Because the last one was about Lots Road. This one's about my flat. I'm on Royal Crescent, and we flooded dreadfully in 2007 with sewage and water. Your guys came the next year to do an analysis of the sewer, and the report was that the sewer along the road was too small for any action to be taken, and it was Velt or something like that, the company you used. So we did nothing about it. Then flooded dreadfully badly last year, exactly the same thing but far worse. I've had my survey done, I haven't had the reply. Now, I then discovered in the interim between 2008 and last year that 1, 2 and 3 Royal Crescent were given flips. I'm at 4, nothing. 5 and 6, nothing. 7 and 8, nothing. 9, nothing. All of us, dreadful last year. Further down Royal Crescent, there were 2 tanks put in on the roadside, not the flips on the sewer, but sort of tanks set in. So, we're all on the same sewer. Why the hell were we told that the sewer was too small to do anything, whereas all these other people got what they asked for? I mean, it was irrational.
We have found some inconsistencies with our 2007 work. We haven't got all the details, so in some cases, most definitely not your case, we found a few customers who refused to flip. So I know of 2 or 3 cases where the whole road had a flip, one customer refused it. Since then, that property's been sold, a new person's purchased it, flooded, they've asked for a flip, we've agreed to put one in, and we're resolving that issue.
But I've asked for one, but no one's come back to me.
Unfortunately, I don't have all the details to look up your case right now.
No, of course not.
So we need to look into it. But part of the resilience work that Alex has spoken about a fair amount today is to make sure that where there are any consistencies, like the odd one I explained, we address those. The reason for the tanks, and I'm suspecting it because again I don't know the street off by detail, is when you install the flips, like Alex mentioned, you have the possibility of moving the flooding to another location.
Yep.
So you then put the tanks in, so that
nobody flooded in all those houses I've mentioned to you last year. Nobody flooded. Everyone flooded who hadn't got something. Yep.
Okay, we'll have to have a look at the specifics of that case and just understand how it is. But if you've had a survey, that most likely means that any inconsistency that happened after 2007 flooding will be rolled up and resolved, and you should be at the same level of protection.
And how do you get on a priority list? I mean, I'm 75, I live on my own, double flooding. Am I unable to be on a priority list?
We'll give you the address for registering with the Priority Services Register.
I know about that. You have to have had a heart attack.
It's got different gradings of priority, I'm afraid. And I'm afraid you're quite young compared to some of the people on the Priority Services Register.
I understand that.
Thank you very much. Before I conclude again with members' questions, I realise obviously we've changed the agenda a little bit. Is there anything that you haven't already told us to Thames Water about the Sewer Resilience Programme, operational response, or future flooding risk management, which you feel you particularly want to highlight to us this evening?
Only to say that we have a parallel programme that's looking at where we've got trunk sewers, so the big sewers that the other sewers connect into, and they're big enough for people to access, as in our engineers can walk down inside them. We've got a rolling programme which started in your neighbouring borough in Hammersmith and Fulham and is coming to Kensington and Chelsea later this year. We are looking at sites where we've got flooded properties adjacent to these big trunk sewers, and we're going to be surveying those areas to see if there's anything we can install without doing the full property survey. Put in a non-return valve or something like that, and we are coming to your area soon. I think we're going to start in Arundel Gardens, and then we're looking at where else there are. Clearly, it's not going to be we've installed about 300 measures for about 300 properties in Hammersmith and Fulham. Our initial assessment is it's going to be significantly less in Kensington and Chelsea because you've got less properties adjacent that were flooded adjacent to these big trunk sewers, but we see them as a quick interim measure that we can install where properties are at risk. So I will, as soon as I have more details, I will pass them to you and to the flood risk officers.
Thank you, that would be helpful, thank you. Mike, again, before we return concluded members' questions, is there anything that you'd like to share on your views on future flooding risk management, what we should be doing, or indeed the Thames Water's Operation Response or the Sewer Resilience Programme that you haven't already? I know we've covered them in fair detail.
Yeah, not much to add really. I think that, go back to one of my first points, is that we are all conscious in the water sector, and I'm an engineer in the water sector, that the drainage issue is a significant and growing one. There's an awful lot of impermeable area around, and climate change is not on our side. So something has to be done. It has to be done, in a structured and organised way. We don't want to compromise to save one person's risk at the expense of somebody else's. So these have to be done in a structured way. It's not easy, but it has to be done because we are at risk of having people living in properties which are effectively untenable if we can't do something about it. So all moves we can do to help support this campaign in London, by giving information, by sharing information, by making sure that you report when you're flooded, and everything that can be done from an institutional level to make sure that the local authorities and the water company and the blue light services are working in a coordinated way as possible is really going to help. It has to happen.
Thank you, Mike. Likewise, Doug, is there anything that you'd like to comment on future flooding risk management, or indeed the operational response from Thames Water or the resilience programme, before we conclude with members' questions?
I was going to raise an issue which Mike has just raised, and with some trepidation, Chair, I would just suggest a couple of things that have been said tonight that you might want to consider when you prepare your final report. And one of them was that you're confident that what Mike described as governance will be effective in the future and comprehensive in terms of the people who are actually on that group. I think that's an important output that you might want to consider. I think you also want to be confident that Thames Water have learnt from the event, and this has informed investment choices, mitigations, coordination, and how customer contact will be pursued in the future in times of crisis, because unfortunately I think we have to assume there will be other times of crisis, if not quite the same as the one that occurred. And my final one would be that you're confident that existing customer questions to Thames have either been answered or will be answered in the future. And I apologise for offering my suggestions of what you might want to put in your report, but they are my observations from this evening, and I did come to the original meeting about a year ago, and I think that the theme of ensuring confidence in all of the people involved in this, whether it be the local authority or whether it be the GLA or whether it be Thames, is really important for both the well-being of residents, but also for effective future situations. And I think the gentleman who talked about sewage in the basement is a good indication of the real impact on real people, that the catastrophe of sewage into people's houses is so bad that that can never be underplayed.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to ask for final questions from members, and I'm aware, last word to a resident who wishes to speak. Thank you. Gardner.
Thank you. Just two things. One, I wasn't quite clear what the engineers are doing down in the big sewers. It would be helpful if you could just clarify that in terms of what steps they are taking to improve something. And secondly, going forward, you're hoping to finish all the surveys in January. Can we have some regular updates as a council that we can share with residents? And I'm not asking for specifics, but I'm saying that you've completed X surveys in the borough, you've done this. And can we have those at regular intervals? Because it is this silence and this pervading issue that you have residents we're still not connecting with. But if we can actually show that things are happening, residents will feel more content. They may not be happy with the outcomes, but at least we can see that there is progress happening.
So yes, apologies for my clumsy description. So what the engineers do is they go down these trunk sewers and they look at how the properties are connected to the trunk sewer, and where a property is reported flooding, we install a non-return valve into where the trunk sewer meets the property's sewer. So that stops the trunk sewer backing up into that property. So it's just it's a quick thing we can do without having to gain access to people's homes in a way we can't do when the sewer is only 6 inches in diameter, for example, or 9 inches in diameter. So that's that. On the question of can we get you regular progress reports, yes, we can.
Jaded?
I have a question for Mikey. Strategic plan 3.5, regreening London. My question is, it says very clear that actually SADs are not 100% to deal with this kind of event, 1 in 100. However, they are helping. So the first question I have, can you predict more than less if we really green everywhere, and I know it's interconnected with global warming and biodiversity, equality, if we really put ourselves into mode of greening SADs anywhere possible, will it to some extent cut the flooding damage we've been sort of suffering? And another question I have, it's more specific. It's point 28, which is in regards to planning. Local planning authorities to amend, so this is recommendation, the planning policy where there is a known risk of sewer flooding to incorporate any basement development or construction work. I really want to know what kind of amendments you have in mind, because I am a little bit foggy about this point, particularly when there is a basement development in a place like Countess Creek Watercourse. What amendments would you like councils within London to implement? Thank you.
Oh, just to clarify, those were for Mike.
I'm happy to answer those because I have fairly...
if we could have Mike first, as the question was towards Mike, and then I'll bring in Thames Water as well.
I'm afraid I really struggled hearing that. The sound was not very clear. So could you recount the question, please, because I completely missed it.
Your recommendation was in regards to SADs, and I read from your recommendation that SADs cannot deal with this kind of event of flooding we had 2021 July. However, they are quite helpful. So can you give us a prediction what will happen if we really, as a council, get into greening of our borough and really implement SADs wherever possible? So it's one of the questions. Prediction, how much it will
I'm sorry,
help.
it's very, very echo where you are, and I really can't hear what you're saying. I'm really sorry.
Are you able to hear me clearly, Mike? The question was...
I can hear you, yes.
The
It's
question,
less echoey there.
Sure, sorry. The question is about SUDs and their overall effectiveness, and if we were to do more in terms of greening, general biodiversity, and greater implementation of SUD schemes, what do you think the overall impact of that could be in terms of resilience towards future flooding events?
No, I'm sorry, I missed that again.
Okay.
This is not. It's gone very, very echoey for some reason. I'm sorry, I'm losing the.
I hope we'll
sound.
be able to get back to you.
I can.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sure.
If you write the question
Mike,
down, I'll respond.
we'll follow up with
finding
you
it
on
very
that.
hard.
We'll follow up with you on that question, Mike. Definitely.
Yeah, sorry.
Thames Water.
So to answer the first part of your question, we have done some research into that. That's part of the drainage and wastewater management plans. I was very surprised at the results that were found. So if we were to, as you say, go all out for it in terms of greening, you could make a significant reduction. I haven't got the specific details for your borough, but we have them within reason in some data we have. What I can say is it's not going to deal with those really big storms. It's probably going to help up to about a 1 in 50 rainfall event. And as you start doing it, it will first help the low intensities. And as you get to a really high level of SUDS implementation, then you'll start really realizing the benefit on the high ones. When you look at the current baseline flood risk in your area, in your borough, as well as the predicted increase due to climate change, SUDS alone will not achieve the benefit we think we need to achieve. There are parts of London where it will, but that's very, very few. So you would still need some grey infrastructure, bigger pipes, bigger tanks, at a 1 in 50-year level. We haven't done any work in the drainage and wastewater management plans above a 1 in 50-year level, simply because it was 3 years worth of work, fairly intensive work, and the flooding happened in the last of those 3 years. So we couldn't take the knowledge and understanding of the flood and build it in. But SUDS implementation is a really good way of doing it. You will get significant benefits, not just for floodwaters. You'll get the urban heat effect, you'll get the biodiversity effect, you'll get the mental health and well-being effect from all of that, and we strongly support you and will work with you in the future to implement it. Your second question was around basements. That's even easier to answer. Your borough was the first one in London to have a comprehensive basement development policy. It is outstanding, it is the model for the rest of London, and you implement it really well. So I don't think you have a requirement to do much more in terms of basements. So far you've led the way. If anything, just when you refresh the policies, make sure it's still up to date.
If I can just mention, I know the resident, and he's on the Countess Creek water flooding, and he has literally basement flooded for 3 years. They pump it out, it's coming back, pumping out. So my concern is, even if you do tanking, and it was done, and quite a lot of money were invested, since water is coming, what else this gentleman could do to stop it?
So basement flooding is really tricky. If you look at the cases of long-standing basement flooding that we haven't been to resolve, there's not many of them, but they do provide the most challenge to us. Sources of basement flooding could be the sewer, which we've heard for examples from today. It could be high groundwater levels, which obviously tanking normally works. It could be water main bursts. It could be a combination of those three events. And so to identify clearly which of those it is, especially when it's a combination, proves to be exceptionally tricky. And that's often why those cases do run for very long. Additionally, there are different parties responsible for all of those. Most of the groundwater flood risk is the responsibility of the owner of the land, with a little bit of responsibility for investigating, I think, by the lead local flood authority. I could be corrected on that, I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, the sewer flooding element is the water company, and similarly with, there are cases where we have underground leaks on water systems that don't manifest themselves on the ground, so no one sees a leak in the road, and that causes a level of, let's call it basement seepage, because it's long duration, short volumes that just keep coming. But they are really challenging to inspect. So as we mentioned previously, we're happy to look into those cases and see as best we can help the residents in those scenarios.
Can we conclude with the gentleman who was asked to speak? Thank you.
Thank you. I feel quite special now. I'm not a resident. I am a senior building surveyor for Notting Hill Genesis. My name's Jerome O'Toole. We refurbished approximately 250 flooded basement properties around the Kensington and Chelsea and Brent and Hammersmith and Fulham areas. So those works are now coming to an end after a year, after spending several £1 million of remediation works. I just wanted to know that, I wanted to be certain that you have the information from us about the properties that were affected by those floods. And my second question relates to the flip devices, which we were informed were no longer being provided by Thames Water, and that program had been discontinued. Is that the case, or will you be reintroducing that or something similar? Thank you.
So I know that we've been doing a lot of work to reach out to the social housing providers. I know that Notting Hill Genesis is one of our key contacts that we've been making contact with. Whether we have the full list, I will go back and check. So I will, please, if I can take your details, then I can make sure that we've got the right contact to come to if we haven't. Certainly it sounds, if we don't, then there's something very missing gone awry there, because we've been trying very hard to contact all the social housing providers because of the obvious issues around vulnerability and affordability. The FLIP program, as you were describing, it was probably the Countess Creek program in 2007 floods. It isn't finished, as in the sewer flooding resilience program I spoke about earlier will install flips for high vulnerability households at high risk of flooding. And so if we've surveyed your properties and come to the conclusion that that is requirement, we will install a flip. But just to remind, to say that they generally tend to be the exception rather than the rule, because we've got to make sure that the measure is appropriate to the risk the property faces.
Just to clarify there, when you talk about high vulnerability, you're talking about the property, not the resident who happens to be living there.
It's all of it. So the term I would use would be triple jeopardy. So where have you got a property with a high probability of flooding, the high vulnerability as in the property is a self-contained basement flat, and then the inhabitant, the customer, resident, whatever, is themselves also highly vulnerable. You know, that triple jeopardy is what keeps me awake at night, is you know, that the dreadful loss of life of someone flooding in a situation like that. So they are our highest priority, and we will seek to address them first and ensure that the risk solution is appropriate to that level of risk.
Okay, thank you very much. A final question, and then we will conclude. Thank you.
So this is just about future risk management, because it's just come in my head about, so you talk to all the different boroughs, because the amount of work, building that's going on in the area, so we've got like 7,000 new buildings that are going to go up in like North Kensington, where the Sainsbury's is, 25,000 in Brent, where of course Old Oak Common, they're coming online in the future. You've got the stuff at Westfield, all that is to do with sewage and water management and everything, and that's all going to come down the Counters Creek, preferably because it's so local, down towards the Earls Court area. Is there infrastructure being upgraded as part of that? Because there's quite a lot of properties that are coming on. So even just that, I don't know how many in Westfield, there's a couple of thousand at least there, 7,000 at Sainsbury's, and 25,000 I read for Old Oak Common when that comes on for the Crossrail and the Queen Elizabeth line. So that is a lot of new builds, and I'm sure there's other things, you know, when Earls Court comes up to fruition, yeah, that is a lot of stuff. And also another question, like, I don't know, and who's going to be blamed for all these things? Is it, there's a bit of blame element, but was it Thames Water, the local boroughs and everything? I don't know. But yeah, infrastructure as well, so.
I'm going to repeat something I said earlier, and hopefully I'll explain it a bit better so that you understand it clearly. We do a lot of assessments, especially for large strategic growth sites. So when Old Oak Common was discussed 7, 8, 9, 10 years, I can't remember exactly how long ago, we were in the depths of the Counters Creek Flood Alleviation Scheme and the new storm relief sewer. We did an extortionate amount of work to understand would the development proposal at Old Oak Common adversely affect Counters Creek. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is because you have a single pipe that takes both your dirty water and your clean water, and that pipe is sized for your dirty water, for the rainwater element of it, the clean water element of it, and so it is very large. So what we need to do is we need to manage rainfall. We don't need to manage waste from residentials. There have been odd cases across London where we've had to manage foul water flows. The most famous one is all the development around Vauxhall 9 Elms. We knew that even if you took all the surface water out at Vauxhall 9 Elms, you would still cause flooding because there were so many homes. And so we built a scheme to make sure that there is capacity. We've done assessments for Earls Court Exhibition Centre, as I said, Old Oak Common multiple times, because we know they're going to implement the surface water management strategy, which means that they are required to do through their planning. That will reduce the speed at which the water comes into our sewer. And for that reason, we don't need to make it bigger. And so we work really closely with the local flooding authorities and the planning authorities to make sure that that happens, that they meet the rules, that they do whatever the planning condition says they need to do. Because if they don't do that, then we would need to make the pipe bigger. But in general, across London, development on the combined sewer network is beneficial to those people who flood, because it slows the flow down. It means that your chance of flooding ever so slightly decreases by someone else's activity.
If I might just add to that, we also strongly push water efficiency messages, so working with developers, so actually the amount of wastewater produced is reduced as well. And certainly with Old Oak Common, we've been working with them on an integrated waste and water plan. And what we're pushing them to do is to say, can you actually store some of your rainwater to use for your non-drinking water purposes, flushing loos, watering gardens, cooling, etc. So we're still fighting that battle. We believe developers could be doing a lot more to drive water efficiency. But we are hopeful in such a big new development that there are significant opportunities for them to incorporate rainwater harvesting, water efficiency, SUDs. So actually the net impact of that development is way lower than what it would have been without it.
Thank you very much. we are bringing this evening's meeting to a close, but the work of the working group continues on. If you have additional questions, and we've been through a lot this evening, please do send them in, scrutiny@rbkc.gov.uk. We are also continuing our call for evidence as well. James, can you remind me the end date for that, the 5th? Friday the 4th of November. Please do submit any experiences, yourselves, neighbours, views about any of the matters we've been discussing. We really do want to hear from you. Just leaves me to say thank you, first of all, to Mike, joining remotely with us. Get well soon. And thank you to Graham, to Alex from Thames Water, and to Doug as well from the Consumer Council for Water. Thank you very much and good evening. Thank you.